All right, let's get started, and I will begin by welcoming you all. Thank you for coming to Humanities Decanted, the IAC's informal showcase in which faculty members present and discuss their newest research and creative work. My name is Susan Derwin. I'm the director of the IAC, and it's my pleasure to see you all today. So before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would like to pay respect to elders, past and present. And I am truly delighted to welcome our featured faculty member, Professor Juan Cobo Betancourt of the History Department. Professor Cobo is a historian of colonial Latin America who studies the history of the indigenous peoples of the region of modern-day Colombia. He is also a practitioner of digital humanities and digital public history. And today, Professor Cobo will be discussing his new book, The Coming of the Kingdom, the Muisca, Catholic Reform, and Spanish Colonialism in the New Kingdom of Granada, which appeared with Cambridge University Press in 2024. And he will be in dialogue with Professor Antonio Cortijo from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, who teaches and researches on topics in medieval and early modern Spanish, including nation building, power and ideology, and religion and economy in the late medieval through 18th centuries. So Professor Cobo will begin with a short presentation, and then he and Professor Cortijo will speak with each other for about 30 minutes. And following their conversation, we will open the discussion to you, our audience members, so that you can ask questions and share your thoughts. And as I said, feel free to enjoy or to continue to enjoy the snacks during the event. So now we'll start with Professor Cobo's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan, for that introduction, and also for inviting me to this wonderful event. If you could press and everyone else also create this.
Yes,
Possible. Kiss the mic. I'm mummy, so do that way. In advance of today, Susan asked me to give you a few remarks about the book, so I thought I would give you an idea of how I came to this topic and what some of the things that I did to do with it. So the Coming of the Kingdom is my attempt to make sense of the profound changes undergone by the Indigenous Muisca peoples of the Northern Andes in the century or so after the European invasion of their lands in the late 1530s, and of the complex processes through which, in circumstances of great inequality, violence, conflict, and dispossession, indigenous peoples, settlers, bureaucrats, and missionaries together brought into being and sustained this colonial realm or territory that came to be known as the New Kingdom of Granada, the region that is now broadly in modern-day Colombia, Uruguay, the little map. So this is the Northern Andes, and this is the region, the Muisca heartlands that I studied. This project began as an effort to think about religious conversion and its role in Spanish colonialism, especially during the period of profound change to Roman Catholicism that we know as the Catholic or Counter-Reformation. Its kernel is very personal to me. I'm a Colombian who grew up in the UK, which is why I sound like this, and I obtained historical education in both countries. In the UK, historical education in school is, or at least was, heavily weighted towards the early modern. The Tudors and Stuarts, the Reformation, the Civil War, the Republic, the Glorious Revolution, the beginning, in short, of all things distinctively English and exceptional. In contrast, save for a cursory look at the European invasion or the conquest, as it's better known, this period is almost entirely neglected in Colombia, where historical education really begins at independence and the history of Colombian nationhood. No one could tell me how the place where I was from fit into this early modern story, these histories of Reformation, these trends that I was learning and becoming so interested in, so I set about finding out for myself, and this became something of an obsession. The subject first of an undergraduate thesis, then an MA, which became my first book, then my doctorate, then a further project became my second book, and then finally, The Coming of the Kingdom. As I explored those themes more and more, I began to develop the nagging realization that much of what I thought I knew, or what we thought we knew, about the construction of Spanish colonialism in the Northern Andes, about this new Kingdom of Granada, did not really make sense. Some of this had to do with the archive itself, which I hope we can talk more about. And a lot of it also has to do with the shadow of the two centers of Spanish Empire in America, the complicated legacy bequeathed us by generations of scholarship on Latin America that understood the histories of Mexico and Peru as normative, and other regions in terms of deficit and failure. As a result, this project, this book really, became an effort to make sense of the creation of Spanish Empire from the ground up. It became more than a history of the quote-unquote religious questions that had led me here, and grew into a broader history of colonialism, law and institutions, political economy, and historical writing. I try to use what appeared at the outset to be a limitation, a comparative lack of sources, as an opportunity and a source of insight, arguing that trying to understand the shape of the archive and the processes by which the sources that we do have came to be, in particular the mechanics of two key modes of colonial governance, on one hand petitions and rescript, and on the other visitations. There's much to reveal about how indigenous communities, settlers, the church and civil officials tried, and more often failed, to order and reorder this new Kingdom of Granada. I tried to show that the development of Spanish colonialism in the Northern Andes was not the old story of a handful of Spanish conquerors and missionaries setting up the machinery of economic extraction, colonial command, and religious conversion, but an uneven, faulting, and complex process. Spanish settlers never had sufficient manpower or resources to make their claims material, or even a coherent vision or policy, while indigenous peoples contested and negotiated their positions from the start, resulting in trial and error, experimentation, and adaptation. Try to show that the unique and specific development of colonial institutions in the Northern Andes was in fact reflective of the nature of the expectations of early modern governance, limited resources, creative solutions, and above all, local circumstance. Within this, none was more important than the complex and delicate ways in which indigenous communities were actually organized, and the complicated and fragile indigenous ritual practices of reciprocity and exchange that underpinned indigenous economic production, communal life, and politics, and much more besides, and which Spaniards, at times deliberately, at times out of ignorance, dismantled over the course of the 16th century with catastrophic results. Doing this work involved a fuller and deeper reckoning with the internal instability, contingency, and anxiety at the heart of the creation of this new kingdom, and of its missionary project than I think we'd had before, realizing that it was not the progressive unfolding of a predetermined plan or the story of missionary success or failure, but something much more complicated, participatory, incomplete, and contested. In a different scale, the book was also an effort to contribute to the work of decentering the Catholic Reformation, to show that far from a monolithic blueprint unfolding from Rome, there was a complex, contested process in which myriad actors jostled, competed, and negotiated with one another, not just in Europe, but in lots of little places, like these towns, to interpret, adapt, translate, and take advantage of the impetus of religious reform to pursue their own interests, from the King of Spain himself down to his humblest indigenous subjects. This was how, after decades of profound and overlapping crisis, in the 17th century, indigenous people, a group of reform-minded Jesuits, colonial officials, and settlers began to work in tandem, if at times still at cross purposes, to bring substantial reforms to the missionary project of the New Kingdom, dramatically altering its course. In the end, what the book argues is that indigenous people were able to negotiate the terms of their own Christianization at a local level in transformative ways, finding in Christian institutions and practices ways to repair and preserve bonds and relations that were rapidly unraveling, to cut off and shed old ones that were no longer relevant, and to establish new ones that made sense in a changing world. In doing so, they shored up not just their own communities, but the kingdom itself, for better or worse. And in doing so, I think, the story invites us to reconsider how we think colonial rule, religious change, imperial governance, and Catholic reform worked in this space and beyond.
Juan, I want to thank you first for inviting me to be here and to be a reader of your book and for putting me on the spot. so that I have to come up, with intelligent questions for you. Well, he was explaining, how he came to the topic that he was writing about. Let me tell you, how I've been reading the book. I've been reading the book, as a historian of the late Roman Empire, as a historian of the late Middle Ages, and as a historian of the early modern period. I do many things, but one of the things I do is that I also study the development of Christianity in many different parts of Europe and the Americas. I've been following your books right from the beginning. First, the book that you wrote with your wife about the new documents, the documents that you unearthed in the archives of the new Kingdom of Granada. Then I followed with the book that you wrote, The Heralds of God. And now, a second book along the same lines. Now it's not the heralding of God, but the arrival of the kingdom. The kingdom has already arrived. I would like to highlight 2 or 3 things that I consider particularly relevant about your book. Juan tries to study the development of an identity in the new Kingdom of Granada. So the territory has been conquered, the native population has been subjugated, but we still don't have nationhood. We still don't have an administrative system taking hold. And we have something that's very important, is that we have marginalized populations. Coming from the late Roman Empire, coming from the late Middle Ages, I could say that the establishment of nationhood in Europe and in America has to involve necessarily the incorporation of those minorities and that margin into the center. And I think that was particularly relevant how that was achieved, especially in the Kingdom of Granada. It's not the only place where it was done in Europe also. It was done, through confraternities. Confraternities, were religious brotherhoods whose content was really not religious. They were more about creating the social fabric of society, and it was one of the few places, where the native population would participate at large. So to some extent, what Juan is concluding in his book is that the state and the religion were created in New Granada, were created not from the top down, but from the ground up. So it was those margins and those marginalized populations, the ones that, by participating in all these different congregations, they actually made their voices heard. And maybe to expand a bit more, about that, how that process came about.
Thank you. So thank you for reading this, for engaging with it. I suppose one of the things that is really interesting to me is the way that we tended to think of this as something. You've mentioned several things. First is we tend to think of this as something that is purely religious, right? That it's something to do with belief, rather than something that is to do with practice and everyday practice. And that's a really interesting insight. And I think that what I began to do effectively was to move beyond. I came to this in a very traditional way. I was really interested in how things were supposed to work. I've read, the book that you mentioned that I published with Natalie as a collection of the legislation of the churches and the fair. It tells you, it's a conventional story. This is how an institution is supposed to run. This is how this missionary project is supposed to be organized. These are the actors. This is what they're supposed to do. And it was a really interesting way of comparing how that is set up in this space and how it works in other places. But it was really not very satisfying because it bore no relation. The more I looked at what was actually happening in these small towns, what was happening to all of these different people, it bore very, very little relation to what was actually happening. What was actually happening is a very different story, where the power belongs to the people on the ground, who are organizing themselves in really very interesting ways to essentially survive in a very profound change. This is a period where, over the course of the century that I studied, the indigenous population collapses by about 80 to 90% in 100 years. So this is something that is unrelenting. The number of people who are dying through successive waves of epidemics, which also affect everyone's society. There's a kind of virgin soil epidemics we identify a small group. And so this is a period of profound kind of destabilizing crisis, indigenous economic kind of structures, political structures, social structures are all unraveling. And what is really interesting is that in the 17th century, we're beginning to see this beginning to slow down, this unraveling, this people were, following, of course, the 16th century, people leaving the region and so on. And a big change comes with the kind of embrace of these Christian institutions, which do many, many things. They are, as you say, they're a social safety net. So in a period of profound demographic collapse, they provide social assistance. They ensure that people have someone so you pay a kind of a membership fee depending on your ability, and then the most basic way is ensures that you have a good kind of a funeral and people remember you. But it also then means that people look after, maybe you left your children, right? And that's someone looks after the children. Maybe you have, you become injured in some way, or unable to work, confraternity looks after you. Maybe you need some assistance doing something. So confraternities are essentially a new kind of fabric of social assistance and poor relief. And this is the case also in Europe. And through them, what I began to see was that a lot of these communities, indigenous communities, begin to really reorient themselves. And in some regions and in some places, what they do effectively is that the old indigenous nobility, the old kind of rulers of the town, the old elites, embrace confraternities and kind of become, and this is what the cover of the book is. This is a painting commissioned by one of these confraternities in a little town called Colombia, and you can just see in the bottoms at the edge of the painting, but also this child is here, how an indigenous family is at the center of this, and that not because the man in question, his name would be just remarkable for a painting of this period, and the enemies of who he is exactly. His name is Pedro Tahuaco, and he was the indigenous ruler of Colombia, and his family, and his little son. He's there not because he's the ruler, he's there because he's the head of this confraternity. The commission that paid for the painting. So in some places we see indigenous rulers who reinvent themselves as Christian leaders effectively by investing very heavily in running and organizing these confraternities. In other regions where the traditional indigenous kind of social and political structures have collapsed, we see new people coming in, often women, people who had been previously excluded from indigenous political parties, who begin to fill these voids. And to use these institutions to support their communities in different areas. And through them we begin to see people actually coming together in new ways. And ultimately, in a very basic way, also funding and organizing the running and funding of the church and then everything from that.
Yeah, we were talking in these previous days about the fact that confraternity, especially in the 16th century, became extremely important in the Catholic world. And how is the relevance of confraternities, especially the Protestant world, because with the abolishment of the religious institutions and religious orders, all of a sudden the Protestant world has to reinvent, or has to create, or has to define a welfare system, how to take care of poor people, how to take care of hospitals, how to take care of all those different things. The Catholic world, and that happens in Spain, that happens in Italy, or from the territory of the Spanish Empire, and that happens also in America. The way the welfare system and the welfare needs were attended to was precisely through these confraternities. And again, were only nominally religious, because they were really not about religion, they were about the community. Okay, so that's something that I found very interesting in your book, trying to put together what's happening in Europe and what's happening in America. Okay, trying to have like a transatlantic dialogue here. What's happening in America is not separate of what is happening in Europe at all. But let me move on, to the second topic. You devote, a large part of your book, at least one chapter, and you mentioned it, in your presentation about the relevance of the new Jesuit approach to the missionary movement is what happening in the identity of the new Kingdom of Granada. For me, what is interesting, because I've done some research on that, is how the Jesuits were, because of their new approach within America, they were pushed to the margins by the crown in order to let them have, a go at what they thought that was, this new approach to the indigenous population. And so we're going to have the missionary movement in the South America, the Spanish possessions, and the missionary movement, Jesuit missionary movement in the northern fringes, of the empire, basically in the Comanche region, especially, with Father Kino. Have you had an opportunity, to think about, that connection you find in the margin? It's only in the margin when that happens. It doesn't happen in New Spain, that doesn't happen in Peru, that doesn't happen in Lima, it happens, in the very south, the most extreme case, in Paraguay, and in the north.
Yeah, definitely. So the first thing is, I would say that there are Jesuits and there are Jesuits. So there are some places where Jesuits continue to be extremely closely aligned to the institutions of the monarchy. At the heart of, for example, in Peru, they are integral to the development of the Peruvian church, the center. They're at the heart of this very repressive policy that comes to be known as these campaigns to get spiritual idolatry. They are, very closely involved in these things. But there's a split, really, that happens at the end of the 16th century within the Jesuit order between people who favor organizing, essentially complementing the work of the secular church, the diocesan church. Because officially Jesuits are not supposed to run parishes, Jesuits are not supposed to divide their own rules, they're not supposed to be very closely involved in ministering to the laity. They're not supposed to have, those responsibilities. They're actually forbidden from this by their own institutes. And so there's this big division that comes up again and again and again, and essentially everywhere that there are Jesuits. Should we be actively ministering to the laity? Should we be just supporting people, maybe improving the education of the clergy? And the split comes to a head at the end of the century, especially in Peru, where there's this big debate over whether or not to divide the Jesuit province of Peru, which at the time covers all of Spanish South America. And some of the people who were actually protagonists in a lot of my story are part of this group that is saying, we need to organize, and we need to get very involved in ministering to the laity. We need to actually organize these big missions, where they're going to be big residential spaces, where we're going to be essentially in charge of all these different things. We're going to create these big missions, which will be familiar to you if you've, these have been depicted in films and everything else, right? And those Jesuits end up being, through these divisions, one of them being exiled to the new Kingdom of Granada, which serves as a kind of testing ground for this approach. And it's really interesting. There's some really, really interesting actors who then end up, actually they leave this region at some point and they become the architects of the Paraguayan missions, which are very famous. And in doing so, they pioneer a new kind of colonialism, which is no longer reliant on the old 16th century model of Spanish colonialism, which is basically having encomiendas, so essentially a tax farming system where you empower a settler to collect tribute in exchange for funding religious instruction. Parishes, where you basically resettle people and you have a church structure, pretty much, right? And the presence of a relatively kind of coherent Spanish administration that is kind of overseeing both. Instead, you have this kind of much leaner kind of system where you have large missions, and then you have these huge cattle ranches that support them. And then this essentially this is how the kind of, the Orinoco Valley, the Amazon, kind of the lowlands of South America become integrated into Spanish empire effectively, but it's kind of bringing these missions, setting them up, and covering vast territories, huge spaces with very, very few settlers. And that's the model that is then kind of imported into places like New Spain. It's the model that is going to, obviously not under Jesuits or the Franciscans, going to happen here in California.
Or California.
Yeah, it's that kind of,
the Jesuit.
exactly.
Adopted by Francisco.
And that's a different kind of colonialism that is essentially pioneered here. So that's very interesting. A very interesting kind of shift to the story. Yeah.
Well, along those lines, another of the things that the Jesuits, favored was the preaching to the native population in their native tongue. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I was telling you that I had the opportunity of researching the books that were available during the 17th century in Spain, the development, of vocabularies and grammars of indigenous languages. And you talk about that also in your book in chapter 5, chapter 5. Okay, you say that one of the very effective ways of reaching the indigenous population is by preaching to them in their native language. Can you expand any point about how that happened?
Yeah, so language is very interesting to me because this is, so the idea essentially is that in order to, and this is a very, very old debate of Christianity, how much can you translate the mysteries of Christian faith? This is like, in Islam, you don't deal with this problem. If you want to access, these texts, you learn Arabic. And Judaism, again, there's this kind of a very Christian kind of problem of translation, which is never really settled. In the liturgy, we have
It's the language of God. Christianity, the Christian God doesn't have a language.
Exactly. Yeah, this is really interesting. Maybe we can talk a bit more about this. I know that's on the audience. I'm not saying that. And so the question is how much and which languages are capable. Like, is your language good enough? If your language is, there's a kind of just a hierarchy, right? If your language looks like one of our languages, then it probably is, a good one, and we can translate these complicated concepts without distorting them. And that will super reflect positively on you. Right? So Quechua, for example, is singled out as this wonderful language that is very much like Hebrew, according to Osama Mastas, author of one of these grammars. And therefore, the people who speak it are fantastic, great, and so nice. Whereas, this other language, oh, well, that's terrible, and so on. So a lot of the things that people were writing about language, even kind of things that were to be descriptions of languages, actually have very little to do with language itself. They're more about these ideas of how language works, how languages kind of descend from the language of paradise, where the idea is that in this period, linguistic diversity is a terrible thing, it's essentially divine punishment, something to be undone if we're going to bring about, something coming. It is an obstacle, it is a cause of descent. So linguistic diversity is something to be overcome. And so a lot of writing about language is very much about those ideas, not so much about whether or not, it's not the sort of documentation in languages that we'd be familiar with and that we think about. And so when you see missionaries advocating for languages in regions like this, they're doing so to argue, this is a region worth investing our time and energy in. This is a region worth, setting up a province in and doing missionary work. Not so much, here is a really interesting language or here is something. And so for me, this was kind of the beginning of when I started to put on strings and everything began to unravel, because I found all this writing about language, and I found all these grammars, and one of my colleagues identified a new one that we thought was lost, produced by Jesuits. And then I also have all this evidence of people going to indigenous towns just a few miles away from Santa Fe and speaking in this standard language, and these languages that they can, told that they could learn and let's go preach. And nobody understands them, right? And nobody can actually make something out. And so what is happening here? And so I started to dig deeper and deeper and deeper, and I realized actually this is all made up. The languages, there's this huge linguistic diversity that is not visible in these texts, that privilege a certain variety that someone happens to be familiar with, that is not mutually intelligible with other languages even a few miles away. And the purpose of this is essentially to contribute to these ideas about the viability of the space as a territory for colonization or as a missionary theatre or in different ways. So these texts are really produced for external consumption and not really as the instruments of Christianization that they ought to be. And then I began to kind of put at this, and then everything else was became crashing down. I realized there's this there are two registers of writing about this region. There are the things that are produced for export that have to be printed. There's a printing press in this region, so things that are printed in places like Seville, to be read by people in Europe, to be convinced of the viability of the space, maybe join the Jesuits, see the world, go and become a missionary, or maybe go and invest in the space, but that have actually nothing to do with what's happening on the ground. And this is the case not just with the linguistic works, but I also realized very soon also with works of history that purport to describe the indigenous past, or with works of legislation that contain certain kind of descriptions of indigenous people and what they do and how they should be regulated, but actually have no relation to reality. And so, little by little, this is when everything started to unravel for me. And I suppose the rest of this project was trying to reassemble this and to try to see how to put all that together after after following this linguistic kind of through made it more unravel.
It's also interesting for me to see how this accepting of the reality on the ground of having different languages. I had to already talk different languages. Also falls within a mental framework that exists, especially in the Spanish Empire, which is eminently, a federalist environment. I mean, the Spanish Empire doesn't have a language. It speaks Italian in Italy. The Spanish army, in Central Europe, founders, speaks German, basically, or French. In Spain, you have several languages. There's still, people writing in Catalan, writing in Galician in the 16th century. So by the time that they arrive to America, the most normal thing that's part of their mental framework is to live with different languages, and that's exactly what the Jesuits, are going to do. Well, at this point, I don't know if you want to open it up to questions, from people.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a mic, so raise your hand and someone will bring you a microphone. Not someone, Casey Burgers over here. No, Michelle.
Hi, I'm from linguistics, so I'm just curious about the language policy in Colombia. So when you mentioned that they saw some languages as better because they're closer to all languages or whatever, and others were terrible. But I'm wondering, did this occur as part of what some have been calling double assimilation kind of policies? Like the idea of double assimilation where minorities, well, I guess in modern times, it doesn't have a different context, but like in modern times, like minorities are assimilated to the majority, but the minorities that tend to have minority groups are also assimilated into the mainstream of that minority. So in currently Tibet, for example, speakers of one Tibetan languages within Tibet are assimilated into the Tibetan majority, whereas Tibetans are being assimilated into the Chinese majority. So is that something that was going on, or is it quite a different process?
So a little bit in part. So I would say, so let me perhaps tell you a little bit about the linguistic landscape of this space. So as far as we can tell, when Europeans arrive, this is a region that is, well, first of all, it's profoundly disappointed because what they're looking for is another Peru or central Mexico. And instead what they find is a variety of small agricultural societies that are not in any way politically unified. And one of the reasons for this is the complicated geography of the space. This is the region with three mountain ranges that are very fragmented. And even within a relatively kind of homogeneous region, that even come to be known as the Muisca, you have enormous diversity. Linguistically, this is also the case, as far as we can tell. Because one thing that is very interesting is that the Muisca languages, broadly, ceased to be spoken widely in the 18th century. And aside from a few modern methods of linguistic revival, they are largely lost. And those efforts of linguistic revival are drawing from colonial grammars and from surviving Chichen sort of languages from adjacent regions. So really, all we have to go on is the very, I spent years reading. We have a relatively, small archive compared to other regions of Latin America, so my book is to try to read it all, and try to read essentially as extensively as possible within all of these different kind of testimonies of colonial encounters with a particular group in a town. So I looked at 130 odd towns, and I paid very close attention to language and how people are learning languages and how people are communicating from one town to the next. And what I found was that after the Imperial invasion, with increasing kind of movements of people and increasing migration and the dwindling of this indigenous population through racial epidemics and everything else, and there is also a moment when the indigenous communities are resettled into these planned primitive towns, which we can talk about a little bit more, often with communities that speak other languages. This is a period of huge kind of linguistic change. But the language that they're increasingly finding as a common language, as a vehicular language, is Castilian, Spanish, rather than a different variety of Muisca. And this happens very, very quickly. So that by the middle of the 17th century, the vast majority of indigenous witnesses that I find, at least the people who were important enough to be, to speak to a visitor, to a bureaucrat, that sort of thing, universally, almost universally able to speak Spanish, even if they also speak an indigenous language. And so Spanish is really, penetrates very, very quickly. Whereas in other regions of the Americas, a similar process happens, but indigenous languages, indigenous vehicular languages are really become kind of widespread. So we see this happening in central Mexico, we see this happening in the Central Islands of Quechua and Armada. This doesn't happen here.
I see.
And this is not really, it's not really what is supposed to happen, right? From the middle of the 16th century, really from the 1570s, the Spanish Crown's policy is that you're going to find what they call the general language. This is an idea that comes from Peru. They're going to find the big indigenous language of the area, and that's the one we really focus on. You can't possibly learn every language, so you might as well learn the one that most people can understand in some way or other. And this lends itself very well to the Central Andes, where lots of people, at least lots of people that are talking to, can communicate in Quechua, even if they speak other languages. This works reasonably well in Mexico, where people speak Nahuatl, even if they don't necessarily do so at home. This fails catastrophically in the New Kingdom. Except in this official register, right, where they're publishing books in the official general language, Muisca, that effectively doesn't really exist. And so this is what's really happening in terms of linguistic change.
Thank you. Cool.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about the archive and how these texts are preserved and which ones and their authorship and languages?
Thank you. That's a great question, Paul. Thank you. So I think one thing that is important to think about is that unlike regions of Mesoamerica, so unlike regions of Mexico and Central America, we don't have indigenous language archives. We have no, the only texts that we have in indigenous languages are these word lists and grammar books that are produced by Europeans and so we have no idea, and we have very few records. And in all of these materials that are produced in Spanish, even when they mention translators, and translators need to be sworn in, and they're very visible in the archive. We know who they are, we can follow them, we know, the same ones appear again and again. Even though the translators are very visible, the work of translation isn't visible. We have no idea how people are saying things. We see little glimpses of things and how the word is recorded, the word's kind of romanized and written in Spanish 10 different ways in the same document, depending on who's speaking and how they're pronouncing words. But really, that is all we have. So the entire archive is in Spanish. Now, much of what I've looked at, the materials produced by the colonial kind of administration, the big institution here is called the Audiencia, it's a kind of executive, legal, judicial kind of body. It's a bunch of judges, and they run the kingdom. Together, collectively, they're the king, and so the majority of the stuff that we have is produced by them. But their archive burnt down in the 18th century. So actually, what we have is a small proportion of what it would have been a few centuries ago. And even then, that was a much smaller archive than that of other regions where they had more resources, more administrators, more bureaucrats. And so really what we have these little glimpses, these little pictures, and weaving them together was a real challenge. And then the other thing that is really key is that in other regions where we do have better documented trends and so on, but we have a much better archive, we have richer materials, but we have rich indigenous language archives that our colleagues who are from Mesoamerica can look at, or even large bodies of indigenous writing in Spanish, which is something that we don't have, but that is very very important for the history of the Central Andes. Those regions have tended to be a distorting influence, right? Because when we have an inconvenient lacuna, when we have a gap that we're trying to make sense of, often the thing that people have done is to reach for the Central Andean example, usually the Mexican example, and to assume that things must have happened in the same way, because again, sort of this way of thinking about the history of these two places as normative and everything else, essentially, as derivative or perfect, as a version of this. And so a lot of my work was also trying to kind of, put those examples and those ways of thinking to one side and trying to see what we can get from those on the ground. And so most of the stuff I looked at was very, routine bureaucratic writing, visitation reports, officials going into a town and talking to people and asking mundane things, and slowly putting this together, I was able to tell this story.
If I can add something, in what we don't have for that region, as opposed to Mesoamerica, for instance, is this large wealth of texts in original languages, for instance, translated into them. The Jesuits in particular, translate the Spanish classics into different Indian languages, the Nahuatl, Tabasco. Okay, we don't have that for this particular region now. The other thing that we can say earlier is while Mesoamerican archives have been exhaustively cataloged, that's not the case, for the archives, of Colombia. So, there might be, still a lot of materials that are.
But we're working on it. So a lot of my life is also digitizing and preserving it, yes. Well, really all sorts of archives in Colombia, small regional archives, collections that are often uncatalogued, things that are, easily overlooked, and over the last instance, work that I've been doing with a lot of people.
In all likelihood, there's a lot of materials that are going to be.
And there are lots of things. And already this work has transformed my own scholarship, so we began looking at these little places, these little parish archives, with these sorts of materials. And a lot of what I do is trying to preserve them and to show them.
Thank you. Thank you, Antonio. Thank you, Juan. Regarding that difference that you mentioned, that your intervention was precisely to highlight how in these peripheral areas, the process of conquest, quote unquote, was very different from the places like Peru or New Spain. Is there there were other many marginal places, of course. So I'm wondering if there's research done in about other places. What you mentioned Paraguay briefly, maybe, I don't know, places like Chile or Argentina. To the best of my knowledge, very little has been done in Venezuela, which is also a very peripheral, marginal area. So I'm wondering if there is people working on these things and how the colonization in these peripheral areas was radically different from what Pilar Neves would.
Thank you. That's a really excellent question because it's a nice opportunity to highlight work of a lot of colleagues and friends who are doing this. So I think one of the things that I learned during this project is that even though we've been kind of used to thinking of these two imperial kind of centers as paradigmatical, these are really the exceptions, right? There's only one Mexico and there's only one Lima. That there are many, many little towns like this with very small Spanish populations. With
the majority of them.
This is the majority. So if you look at, one of the things that is really interesting that's happening in our field, more broadly, and that I'm very, very proud to be involved in, is that we're looking in places like Venezuela, we're looking in places like Paraguay, we're looking in places like Guatemala and the Philippines, all of these different places, and realizing that actually we have a great deal more in common than these other places, right? The same with a lot of the Caribbean, the same with essentially everywhere you look, looks more like this. And, I think if this book, does anything, I hope it helps to provide a kind of, perhaps a methodological clue as to how historians of those regions might approach the, patchy archives, the messy institutions, the, all these things that they've taken for granted in different spaces. And so, ever since I'm doing this project, I've made it my goal with these colleagues, this is by no means my only, something I'm doing alone, to organize, panels and to bring together people and to, So when you talk about this, because I think this is like, beginning to kind of look around the room and realize that actually, we're not the minority here, but we're actually, this is actually a lot more common than
The majority.
yeah, exactly.
That's something that I wanted to highlight when trying to summarize Juan's book. To some extent, the history of Latin America that will be told, it's a very not true history, because it's the history from the top right down. So it's basically telling you the history based on legislation and synods, but that's not the story, like the real story. Okay, so that's something that Juan happens, to do with this particular book. He's researching the real story of this region, this small region between the years 1580 and 1640. That's basically a time span of your book. And he's telling you that things don't look at all like what you expect them to look.
Hi. So happy to see your book in the world. It's so exciting. And your conversation very interesting. I want to go back to archives because that's kind of one of my passions, one of my background. And so you mentioned, so when you're talking about the kind of like, that we never can get the full story because archives by itself are very, especially in Spanish Empire, very top down. But you didn't mention there was nothing in the Ayuda de Indians for this region in terms of archival records.
Yeah, there were mountains of things. Yes, lots of things. So I suppose
So
maybe
what are the challenges? Yeah.
So I should phrase it. What I mean by this is, I think there are several ways of answering your question. One is that all archives are intrinsically constructed, right? Every archive is the product of very conscious decisions about what to collect and what to preserve and what to, make accessible and how. This is something that all historians have to be done with. Yeah. Archives are not incidental, especially, when we're working on, subjects like this. They're also, every archive is reflective of power relations, its production, all these different things. There is also there's a more specific kind of answer here, which is that it's very easy to work on the materials that are easily accessible in places like Seville, and that tend to encourage you to think of things in a certain way. And so I spent a very long time in this archive. This is the General Archive of the Indies, which is kind of the archive where a lot of the working papers of the central institutions of Spanish rule are now housed, and this is a wealth of material, but it's also not necessarily top down. So a lot of what I do is look at the history of petitions,
Right.
and the history of how through basically requests to the monarch for all manner of things, whether for the monarch to intervene in a case, in a lawsuit, or for the monarch to grant a gift or an office or this sort of thing. People present a certain vision of themselves and of the kingdom and of the state of things, and these can be extremely kind of rich. And then the thing that's really interesting, and this is something about to look about some more, is that these petitions are also the foundations of Spanish law, right? Petitions, as in other kind of pre-modern governments, petitions are then read in that process, and they become rescripts that are then sent back in answer to the petitions, often echoing in many ways repeating the language of the petition itself and making its claims about representing a certain space. So, for example, claims about the status of Santa Fe and the conditions of indigenous people and the need for a certain intervention, right? Get to Spain, and they're considered, and this is all that the monarch sees, and then the monarch acts on the basis of this report, and then sends something back, and then in the process entrenches this particular vision, and gives it the force of law, and to us historians gives us the impression that this claim that is made by a settler is a fact, right? Is a thing that has some basis in reality. And so a lot of my work is also kind of unpicking that and thinking about, well, what is, so this is what I mean by paying attention to the shape of the archive, where things are produced, thinking carefully about the ways in which, like, a lot of resources are produced in terms of, requesting things, presenting, having an interest in showing a certain interpretation. So. But then there is another body of sources which is not produced for this external consumption, right? Which is what I meant. So for this I mean the routine kind of bureaucratic writing of an official who goes to a little parish, and then that parish meets a priest who then describes how so-and-so gave this painting in this book that is, carefully kind of stored in the parish archive for, the next few hundred years. Those are the kinds of sources that paint a very different picture to the picture of the petitions, of the rescripts, of the legislation, of the language books, of the synods and councils, of the works of historical writing, right? Which are not necessarily top down, they're also participatory, they're also produced by a very broad range of people, but which only tell us one side of the story. So if you for many, many years, people have been doing this kind of work and trying to make sense of this history by centering things like the sources that you find in the archive of the Indies. And it's a very different picture if you look at other things as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I just wanted that clarification because I wasn't sure when I heard the first part that you were including what you had done in Seville.
There's also something else that is extremely important. So when you talk about archival research and archival sources, for the history of the region that one is trying to do, you have to recognize that archives are basically repositories of material.
Well, they're more than that, but yes.
I know that they're more than that, but it's basically repositories of material. There's no better archives in the world than the Spanish archives.
Yeah.
They kept absolutely everything. The problem is that they kept absolutely everything. So unless you have, a catalog of the materials, those materials are basically useless because you need somebody to be reading through the thousands of pages to tell you what you can find there. That has been done for Spanish archives. So most of the Spanish archives from Spain, those are cataloged. That's not the case with the Mexican ones. Only like around 85% of them are cataloged. So you still have a lot of miscellaneous volumes. So you have a volume like this one that has 400 pages, and we don't know what's inside. There's 400 pages. We have no idea what's inside. We need to get a scholar. We need to find a scholar. We need to pay a scholar to go there for 3 months to read the 400 pages and to write a summary of what each document is about. We don't have that for 15% of the Mexican documents. Now let's go down to Lima, Peru. There, we don't have even catalog for 50% of the material. Now when we go, to New Granada, it's even less. So someone has to go down there to actually read the materials and to tell you what they are about. So that someone that is interested, about Muisca language, can actually, go to the internet and can do a search about Muisca language or documents in the Muisca language. And you will be able to access them and read them. But it's not right now, we don't even know which ones, are in the Muisca language. And that's about money. That's basically.
Oh, no, talk to me understand that.
Juan, what I wanted to talk a little bit, because you did it in another presentation, is about the actual religious practices, because you have talked a lot about languages and documents and all of that. But one of the things that surprised me when you did that presentation is that the Muisca, I correct me if I'm not pronouncing it correctly, managed to embed in the Catholic practices or the religious practices some of their own. So that at the end you said that the religious practices, whatever they were doing, it was a mixture of the two.
Thank you for that. I wouldn't go as far as that. So I think one thing that I really had to grapple with, and so religion is one of those things, and there are people in Sweden, there's nothing like that, but religion is one of those things that everyone thinks they know what they mean when we talk about religion. Actually, it's one of those things that encompasses so many different things that it's actually very, very difficult to pin down. And the first thing that I think, just as historians have to come to terms with the limitations of our sources, we also have to come to terms with the fact that there are things that we can never know. And I think a lot of what comes under the big label of religion is part of that. So what I looked at was not so much what people may have believed or how they may have understood the world or relation with the supernatural or this thing. This is something that has been the subject of enormous amounts of scholarship, actually based on a lot of these kind of materials that I find very problematic. And instead what I looked at was what people do, and how people devote their time and energy and resources to activities that have to do with a whole series of things. And for the Muisca, it's really closely connected to, on one hand, the role of the rulers, of the leaders, the people that Spanish observers will come to call caciques, which is a word they bring with them from the Caribbean, and with political economy, basically with the circulation of products and production of stuff in their communities and how these essentially move through the community. And the way that this happens is basically through indigenous rulers sponsoring religious or ritual practices. These can be celebrations, festivals, feasting, and in these they receive a whole series of things from the community and they transform them in special ways that have an important ritual dimension, and they return some of it to the people who have given it. And so in the process, they're kind of making things flow through this kind of system. A lot of this is to do with the production of food, so people grow maize. Only indigenous rulers can transform that maize into chicha, which is a kind of maize beer. Some of it is to do with textiles, so people produce cotton and cloth. Only caciques and kind of families were allowed to transform them by painting them into these special mantas, these special cloths that only certain people can use and wear. And this is how indigenous rulers basically accumulate the surpluses of the community, which is something that is basically incomprehensible to Europeans who understand these people as the way they understand growing resources, right? As people who control. So to them, rulers control, land, they control resources, they control labor, and they control exchange, or some combination of these. And this is how people relate them, right? And so it's a very, very delicate system. And what happens over the course of the 16th century is that it comes tumbling down. Because first they prevent people from holding these large celebrations, so this flow gets interrupted. Then they prevent these rulers from actually doing the work of transforming these different things. And then eventually they also undermine the whole foundation of the system, which is the fact that through these transformations of these basic products, they're turning them into something special, something else, right? This manta has a different kind of quality, right, now that it's been through this kind of system. And that also goes. So by the end of the century, exchange has basically stopped, and people are not able to collect taxes, effectively, because they've built this entire system of colonial extraction on the assumption that these indigenous rulers are going to be able to do this forever. They're going to be able to continue to extract products. And this basically comes crashing down, and there isn't enough food to go around, there isn't enough food to provide resources for the loaders, where the big coal mines are, everything comes tumbling down. Now, what that has to do with belief is a bit fuzzy question, I already know, but this is what I'm observing. And then in the 17th century, we begin to see an emergence of a different kind of social and political and religious, we might say, organization around Christian institutions, around the production now not of these celebrations around the same Kingdom of Granada calendar that we had before, some similarities, but now around things like the feasts of patron saints. We no longer begin to see celebrations happening in the same ways before, but we now see feasting happening in other kind of Christian contexts. Now, I hesitate to draw a line to say these are functional equivalents. Maybe they are, I don't know. I don't think so. I think there's something more kind of fundamental happening here about how people are kind of organizing themselves and clinging together and surviving and finding ways of doing that. And I'm also certain of the fact that these things that was, maybe devoid of that context, but like the production of things like this is enormously important to people, right? And we see this in their wills, we see this in the things they spend their money on, and the way that they dispose of their remains, and the way that they dispose of their debt, like all of these different things which are windows into how people feel about these Christian institutions. I hesitate to say this is just the survival of some pretty Islamic practice, which is very, very common in the sources. And I think some scholars see this in other bases. For the Muisca, I'm not convinced. I think this is something else. And then maybe we can talk a little bit more about kind of the bigger question of ideas about what happens when you die and things like this, which are definitely changing, right? And you see this in different ways. But this is what I would say. So it's a less satisfying answer, I think, than the one that I set up to find. But I think it's a very revealing one. Yeah. And it's it's not as straightforward as I imagined, but then everything with this space in this region, these questions end up being,
Oh, sorry.
good one for you. Thank you for that, Sylvia.
Hi, Juan. It was a pleasure listening to talk about your book and learn more about it. I'm really, on this topic of whether it's top down or bottom up, or you used a word that I really stuck with me, is contestation. And this is a process that was contested, not simply superimposed. I'm an anthropologist, so contestation happens in real time, but I'm curious about how it happens for a historian and how you locate contestation within the archive.
I see it very clearly in how, so to go back to what we were discussing just now, so how kind of administrators and bureaucrats imagine power works and how it works in practice. So, for example, throughout the 16th century, there is this kind of all-imperial kind of initiative to resettle indigenous people into greater towns. And so this is something that falls to encomenderos, which are these lower, basically, the lowest level of the administration, the kind of essentially tax farmers with various responsibilities, and that give them the right to extract tribute from a community in exchange for performing certain duties, and a lot of it is basically being intermediaries between Spanish administrators and indigenous crews. And that's all. You have to go and resettle people, and you're empowered to go and burn their houses if you need to, go and move them, you have to force them, try to do redemptiveness if it doesn't work, you can do all of these different things, here is how it's worked in other cases, here is the legislation, these are the rules you must follow, here is the standard process. And they're like, we can't. The phrase is, this exceeds the power in our hands. Right, and then they go to indigenous rulers and they say, okay, well, you have to go and resettle the people. You have to go and move people to the space. And they do this is a dramatic example, a really big thing, but they do this in ways large and small. For example, you must pay this much in this product, right? You must pay this tribute in gold instead of in maize. And they're like, no, we can't. Because if I were to ask this of my people, they would leave. And then I wouldn't be a ruler. Right? And so in all these little continued ways in which there's this expectation that you can command people that the rules work in a certain way, that power works in a certain way, this is constantly contested, right? Like if, tell people to go and build this church, love to help, can't. They will, people leave. Or people, will go to the authorities and say, I did that thing that he wanted me to do, and now all my people have basically fled. Can you round them up for me? And they're like, well, we can't either. Right, so no one is in control. No one actually has any power because this entire region depends on, essentially, as in so many others, that the goodwill and the participation of all these people at different levels, finding communities of interest, basically tolerating or not the requests of people who are, officially in a position of power and responsibility. And so I see it in real time as well. Yeah, constantly. And the thing that is really striking is that and again, go back to this kind of dual register. In the letters to the king, the petitions, it's all great, right? They're all powerful, they're super strong, everything is fantastic, we're just, we love some more money, but basically we're definitely in control. And in practice, it's just like, nobody's in charge. How are we going to do this thing? This, commanderized books, hope that nobody notices, kind of thing, because everything is so contingent on people saying yes.
One last question.
I just thought that was a great question to ask. I don't know, is it similar to what I worked on 19th century records in Puerto Rico, and it placed a lot of these contextual things. What happened was in los protocolos notariales and in all the tribunal cases, and especially the first and the second instance, because that were people were able to state like what was isn't working, or they challenge some action from the right power or not. So I think that those are the spaces where regular people can take over and say like, well, this person said this, but actually this is that. And I think that, I assume that similarly you find in different records where two entities were contesting in front of the law. For example, like why this cannot happen or this person don't have that claim, I do, etc. So, did you find that in similar records?
Yes. Is the short answer to the extent that those institutions exist in this period. I mean, the trouble that we have is that they don't for most of this space. Right? So, like, that there are, to give you an example, there are 2 notaries in the entire province of Dunkirk, which has tens of thousands of indigenous people, most of whom will never appear before notary. People in the city of Dunkirk go for notaries all the time, and they go there not just to record important things, but drop off, when they need something written down, they go to the people who know how to do that. They'll record, for example, the receipt for dropping off a pair of shoes to be mended. But in terms of what is happening in these small towns and these small places, we often don't know. We don't have records. We have occasionally these district officials called corregidores that move around. Sometimes some of that paper survive, and I found some really beautiful wills, for example, among those papers of people who don't have the means to go to a notary in the big city, but who, maybe, that's something very informally with, like, the priest or something, or someone who went life. But again, what we have are these little glimpses. We don't have a systematic, right? I mean, it's very easy to imagine the Spanish Empire of, Puerto Rico in the 19th century and imagine that this must have been the case in the past, right? To think that these institutions, because of the sources themselves, right, will tell you that they're timeless, this has always been so, that these have always, existed, that these instances have always, been part of how the system works. To imagine that this is so, but it isn't, right? It's a very difficult problem.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.